There are new revelations, new evidence about the extent of the radioactive contamination that has plagued the St. Louis area since the 1940s. Where did this radioactive contamination come from? Simple. It came from the federal government. Beginning in the 1940s in the Manhattan Project, St. Louis was a center of development for uranium. But what did the federal government do when the Manhattan Project concluded? Well, we know more today after 15,000 pages of documents that had previously not been released were obtained by a parents' rights group in St. Louis and shared with news organizations. Here's what we learned: that the federal government gave this radioactive waste, fobbed it off onto companies in the region who did what? Who poisoned the water, who poisoned the soil, who poisoned the air, and the government knew about it. Oh yeah, they knew about it. They knew about it for decades, and for year upon year upon year, they played down the threats. They tried to hide the evidence. They told the people of St. Louis, oh, everything's fine. No, don't be worried. Don't worry at all. It's all fine. And meanwhile, kids playing along a creek filled with radioactive waste, kids going to school in buildings contaminated by the waste, residents coming out to houses, building homes in areas contaminated. And then the government wonders why the levels of cancer and autoimmune diseases and rare genetic disorders have spiked in the St. Louis region. Oh, we know. We know. It's because of the radioactive material from the federal government dumped into the St. Louis water and air and soil. Let's just review what we have learned. We now know that as early as 1949, that's right, 1949, the federal government paid a contractor, private contractor, to dispose of waste, but instead that contractor left the radioactive waste in steel drums sitting out in the open, in the elements, right next to a creek called Coldwater Creek, familiar to just about everybody who lives in the St. Louis region. It's familiar because whole housing developments and neighborhoods and, schools have been built along Coldwater Creek. Well, as early as the 1940s, that radioactive waste began to leach out of those steel drums into the water, and it gets worse. The same federal government paid another contractor to dispose of other waste, and what did they do? Rather than dispose of it, they drove it to a public landfill. And in the early 1970s, they just dumped the waste right into the landfill. Dumped it right into the landfill. How did this happen, you might ask? Well, as it turns out, that is a violation of federal law, you think? But what did the federal government do about it in the 1970s when they learned that this government-paid contractor had carried out this illegal act? Did they prosecute him? Did they fine him? Did they at least have a hearing and ask some questions? No, no, and no. They did nothing. And so the waste seeped into the soil, spread into the soil, and all the time the people of St. Louis were told, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. A 1976 government test revealed that the levels of radiation in the creek water were at extremely dangerous levels. 1976. And here we sit in 2023, and we are told by this same federal government, the EPA, the Department of Energy, the Army Corps, that the cleanup of Coldwater Creek won't be done until at least 2038. Earlier this year, the school alongside Coldwater Creek, an elementary school, had to close, apparently permanently, because of radioactive contamination found inside the school. Now, in response to that, this body took action and passed my bill to mandate federal cleanup of the school, and if that can't be cleaned up, a new school to be built. And I thank my colleagues for their unanimous support for that activity. But that's not going to be enough. No, it is clear today that further action is needed because the federal government has caused this harm. I want to be crystal clear about this. This is not the people of St. Louis saying that we had a weather incident, which would be bad enough. It's not a natural disaster, which would be terrible. No, no, no. This is their government using them essentially as human guinea pigs. This is their government dumping radioactive material into their water, into their soil, and then lying to them about it. Not even for a year or 2 years, but for 3/4 of a century. And it still continues today. As I stand here, the Army Corps of Engineers insists there needs to be no further testing, either around the elementary school, which is now closed, or anywhere else in the St. Louis region. And at the same time, the EPA is admitting that the radioactive contamination of the soil has spread further than they previously admitted. I mean, what is it going to take to get some basic justice for the people of St. Louis? We're talking, Madam President, about working people. These are people who moved to these regions of the city in search of a quiet neighborhood, a good school for their kids, an opportunity to a better future. These are parents who allowed their kids to play in the creek because wasn't it awesome to have a creek right by their neighborhood? These are parents who sent their kids to the school trusting that they'd get a great education. And what did they get instead? Exposure to radioactive contamination. This shouldn't happen in this country. And when it does happen, the federal government should make it right. That's what needs to happen now, Madam President. I am sick to death of hearing the excuses from this government for decades on end. I am sick of the lies that they have told to the people of St. Louis, to working people from neighborhoods all across the city, that everything is just going to be fine. Just trust us. It's all going to work out. And I'm tired of this administration, which has still refused to answer my repeated pleas, to mount a cleanup effort at Jana Elementary School to clean up Coldwater Creek. All we get is finger pointing and blame shifting. The Department of Energy says it's the Army Corps' fault. The Army Corps says it's the Department of Energy's fault. Heck, for the recent news reports, the Department of Energy wouldn't even comment. They referred the reporters to the Department of Justice. I mean, what next? Here's what needs to happen next. It is time for this body to act. In the past, when we have asked members, citizens, members of this nation, when we've asked them to bear unique burdens, when we have put them in harm's way, we have said, if you will serve your country in this way, we will stand with you. That's essentially what the people of St. Louis have been asked to do. The Manhattan Project, which was a national project for war, the people of St. Louis have borne the burden of it. And now it's time for their government to make it right. What needs to happen is this. The federal government needs to pay the medical bills for any St. Louis resident who has contracted cancer or an autoimmune virus or a genetic disorder because of exposure to radioactive contamination. The federal government needs to act. And so I will introduce legislation that will create a fund to make the people of St. Louis whole. Sadly, for some it's too late. This has been going on for decades, and too many members of our community have already been lost to cancer, to disease, to the hazards that were imposed on them by their government without their knowledge and without their consent. But that is no reason not to act now. We should act and act swiftly to provide remediation, to provide support for every member of this community who has suffered because of the actions of the federal government. We've done it in the past. We've done it for our veterans. We've done it for other folks who have been negatively impacted by the nuclear program dating back to the 1940s, and we should do it now in the city and region of St. Louis. I will introduce legislation that will provide this support, that will provide this justice to the people of St. Louis. And I'll just close by saying this. It is justice that we are talking about. This is not a handout to the people of St. Louis. They're not asking for a giveaway. They're asking for some basic fairness. When their government imposes on them disease and disaster because of nuclear contamination, the least their government can do is to make it right. And I will come to this floor as long as it takes until we make it right for the men and women and children of St. Louis. I yield the floor.